This is Ahead of the Curve, a Bankers podcast. Welcome to our first episode. I'm your host, Thomas Curley, and I'm here with Andy Snow, Senior Vice President of Customer Success at Abrigo, and David O'Connell, Senior Strategic Advisor on Aite-Novarica's commercial banking team. Andy aligns the implementation and customer success teams at Abrigo to ensure clients enjoy a seamless experience during their software implementation process. Prior to his role, he served as the Vice President of Implementation, where he led consultants, project managers, and trainers to help financial institutions use and roll out lending, credit, and portfolio risk solutions. David, on the other hand, is a former commercial lender of 14 years. He brings a wealth of experience on financial institutions' challenges and building businesses that lend safely, cost-effectively, and at scale. His coverage of lending encompasses the entirety of the loan lifecycle, so we're excited to have both of them on today. We're going to be talking about customization versus configuration of software, along with some other implementation best practices. It's been a topic of interest and a source of a lot of questions that I've been hearing from banking circles recently. And I know that everyone's tired of talking about the pandemic, but one of the things that I wanted to talk about, because it's so important to set the stage, is the fast-changing market expectations of digitalization and automation. Many financial institutions are ramping up their technology usage and purchases, whether they had nothing before the pandemic, or maybe they're adding and upgrading based on some feedback over the last 24 months or so. It's a lot to take in, and so that's why I've asked both these experts to join us. To start things off, I'm going to have David jump in and really define what customization versus configuration means when we're talking about it and thinking of how it can play a huge factor in some on-time, budget, and scope projects.
Okay, thanks very much. And it's actually a little bit difficult to define and determine the difference between configuration and customization. I think we all know these two things when we see it, but let's think about a bit of a definition. So I think of configuration, as changing the characteristics of a software capability within the scope of variability for which it was designed. And ideally with such changes made by folks without an extensive technological background, Let's put it another way, If you have meaningfully changed the capability relative to its out-of-the-box configuration, then you have probably configured, not customized, Now let's think about customization. Customization is any transformation of a capability such that it differs meaningfully from its out-of-the-box version, How do we define that? Well, first of all, it's meaningful if the changes increase in a relevant way. The risk that it will break or become unstable when an update or patch comes down the SaaS pipeline. And certainly if you are changing or adding custom code, then that is definitely customization, no pun intended. But with that, Andy, I know that on the topic of customization, you have some thoughts about different flavors, unintentional versus intentional.
That's right. Thanks, David. I do. Oftentimes when one is heading down the path of implementing some enterprise software, it's easy to get lulled into thinking that a lot of what you're going to be doing is automating what you've already done today. Maybe it's manual, maybe it's in another system. And so one of the culprits to people ending up kind of in this customized state is them trying to really kind of replicate what already exists today, which oftentimes has a lot of inherent or bad habits and processes baked into it. So I do know that when one has the mindset of transcending the status quo and really using the implementation of a new service, a new software, a new product, what have you, having the mindset of really using that as a catalyst to start fresh is a great way to avoid the pitfall of customization. In terms of configuration, I think that we talk oftentimes about the pathway to allowing one to actually complete a project and begin using a new product or service. A great way to do that is by ensuring that you are minimizing the decisions that your staff and personnel need to make on a regular basis, that you're leveraging the experience of the provider of said solution and the best practices that have already been kind of baked into the solution. All those lend themselves to really putting you down the pathway of making a few decisions to slightly tweak what exists for everybody.
Yeah, and I think that there are some interesting ways that this plays out in the market or plays out in how end users, meaning the end users, and also the deployment champions, how they feel about their deployments. I happen to be in kind of a lucky situation. I find this business fascinating. I love doing research upon it. I'm often in the neat situation of asking folks, how is your CLO deployment going? And I often hear the response. I ask folks, how did the deployment go? Did it meet your expectations? Were you on budget, on time, things like that? And oftentimes, one might be surprised at how often I get the response that goes something like this: no, and it's kind of our fault. Don't necessarily blame the vendor, okay? Because sometimes, I'm an industry analyst, and I'm often asking questions in the market with regard to vendors, and so folks sometimes take ownership of things not going well. And the reason they take ownership of things not going well is after the go live date and some surprises, okay? Folks realize that they maybe shouldn't have done things as they did during the deployment. And whenever they tell me, no, it's kind of our fault, okay, it almost always has to do with customization, okay? And customization means that you are going to grab a whole bunch of resources in order to kind of, I don't know, over replicate or over memorialize part of the pre-deployment state. And anytime you do that, the grabbing of those resources puts you at risk of going over budget because you spent more money, going beyond the sought deployment go live date because you had to do all these things, and you tend to de-scope. Okay, so let's say you have business requirements that you want to fulfill in 7 or 8 areas, okay? Well, if you over-customize in one of those 7 or 8 areas, one of the other 7 or 8 areas is going to get de-scoped, okay, in terms of features, functionality, business requirements met. And so that's where I kind of feel like it's a problem, is folks telling me, yeah, didn't go all that well, but it was kind of our fault. And we live in a world of scarce resources. To the degree to which we over-customize, it consumes resources, and it has to come from something else. And it will come from that something else in the form of going over budget, over time, or de-scoping something else. Andy, you and I have chatted about this in the past. I think on your mind are some best practices ideas.
Yeah, and you're spot on. When you really think about the effect and how this plays out in the real world, I think that again, to kind of tie this off, right? Oftentimes, a lot of this is just done unintentionally, and it's just human nature. I've seen in many situations where people are really going to the depths of one end to really make sure that they address any and every scenario or exception, which, to your point, then at times will just draw more attention to maybe the squeaky wheel or something that only happens every other lunar eclipse during a leap year, right? And people end up kind of losing sight of the forest because they're just kind of locked down and confused within the tree line. So I do know, in terms of a best practice, the number one is to make sure that your project, your initiative, has some clearly defined goals and objectives that can help remind everybody what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then also be used as really kind of a reference point, a beacon in the midst of people potentially heading down a pathway that's really going to lead to a lot of work and attention, potentially taken away from some other items. beyond that, once you do have those goals and objectives really defined, I think that having a solution, when you think about customization, as you eloquently put it in the beginning, the definition, you want to have a starting point. And if a provider, a vendor is able to at least share with you, here is how a majority of like users are experiencing this product. Let's start with this, and then let's just slightly tweak it based on some configurations and settings and templates to then ultimately make it your own. But rather than reinventing the wheel, we start with one and then we just work to shine it and perfect it.
So, yeah, that's a great point, Andy. And I think we're going to talk about a lot more of kind of the best practices and specifics moving on. But maybe we'll flip it a little bit. We've been talking a lot about why does this happen from maybe a project scope standpoint, but I know we wanted to talk a little bit more from the people side. What are some of the common slip ups that set folks down this customization, configuration path, or maybe it doesn't work out the way they want to?
Right. I think that when I think about that topic, I will just say this, that most challenges that get presented during the course of a technical project implementation, what have you, it's typically fueled by humans that have varying motivations or different motivations. And as I mentioned before, in most cases, it's not an intentional hijacking of a project just because that's in their DNA and they like to see things fail. Typically, what's happening is they're uncertain as to why. Why are we doing this? And as a result of that, they don't know what role they play, and so then they start to really retreat a little bit, resist, because they are uncertain. So I can tell you that just playing off of kind of the best practices, there's a progression that a human needs to go through to accept some change. Let's just assume for this conversation, right? We're talking about implementing something that is going to change how one does their job. So that can be very intimidating, and oftentimes the fear is associated with the unknown. So when we talk about executive sponsorship, executive management, really making sure that we have endorsement at the highest levels for an initiative, you can't downplay that. It's really leadership more than anything, and it starts with clearly defining to everybody, what are we doing, why are we doing this, who are we doing it with, and how are we going to organize around it and make it happen. And that's the kind of progression that one needs to be led through in order for them to ultimately buy in and accept something and be a willing participant. And that is ultimately when you will be able to overcome resistance, and you'll be able to get out proactively and do it just by heading it off at the pass and making sure that you are working to create awareness for everybody, generate desire because people are excited about what it means for the organization and also them individually. And then you work down the pathway then of getting them comfortable with how to use a product, proficient with being able to replicate it over time, and then reinforcement, which we'll talk about later. But the main takeaway I'd like everybody to leave with here on this topic is that it's the job of a leader within an organization, and they can be at various points within the organization to create awareness and generate desire.
I think kind of pervading, so to speak, what Andy was saying a moment ago was the topic of change. And I think change arises in two ways. First of all, folks tend to resist changes because they want to keep the steady state. And they also underestimate the upside available to them that can come with change. Okay. And what's on my mind here is I'm often surprised how common it is for folks to use a CLO deployment to merely automate, kind of replicate, almost memorialize the existing state. And that's really pretty interesting when you think about it. Because do any of us like the existing state of our commercial loan origination, forms, processes, everything? Do we like it so much, everything about it, that we want to memorialize it in a new deployment? Or to put it in kind of a double negative that describes the missed opportunity, I'm surprised how often it's overlooked that a CLO deployment is an opportunity to go blank slate on things like forms, processes, and rebuild these things from scratch. Rebuild what? Rebuild the CPS in general. In particular, all the spaghetti on the front page that is so incredibly labor intensive. Every gadget in the process. And oh, by the way, what about, speaking of change in process, many folks use a CLO deployment, okay, to change and govern who does what. In other words, to kind of institute and govern role-based SLAs. Okay, so I really think that one issue that comes up is that the more we're customizing to replicate the current steady state, the more we are the more we're missing opportunities to undertake changes that we all really want. I mean, nobody really loves the way CLO is done right now. And the more we customize, the less we can act like our own consultants and advocates for change in the environment that we want to have. And Andy, I know you feel kind of strongly about the topic of executive management and mandate and things like goals. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the one of the biggest ways to really generate desire and people getting excited about working on affecting change and creating a new system with new processes and outputs is by giving them an opportunity to actually participate in it and influence the outcome. So, when you think about a best practice for organizing around this, every group that's going to be a potential user and new customer of a new system, give them the opportunity to have their interests represented as a part of the onboarding process, so that it ultimately becomes a system that was configured and designed by them and for them, rather than done in a vacuum by people who think they know how that group does their job today, or worse yet, has strong opinions on how they think they should do it tomorrow. Give people that are going to ultimately be using this thing an opportunity to get in and affect the outcome. That right there is how you create the desire. Is that not only have you told people why we're heading down this pathway and the destination we're attempting to reach, but we're also giving them a chance to actually drive the car a little bit on the way.
And speaking of driving the car, sometimes I think folks don't realize how much a good deployment, kind of with minimal customization, can actually put them in the driver's seat. Okay, there is a persistent fear, less so as a result of the pandemic and all the digitalization that's been required to get through it. There's been this persistent fear in commercial lending in particular, that the more automation there is, the less dispensable I am. The less indispensable I am. This is what lenders often think. But they're missing the fact that with the more automation they have, the more they can move upwards in what I kind of jokingly call Maslow's hierarchy of activities. None of us want to be doing sort of the rote stuff of our job. We all want to be indispensable, frankly, as trusted advisors rather than process handlers. Okay, so I think that overlooked is the fact that with more automation, unclouded by customization, the more value-added activities both underwriters and lenders can do for the client. Okay, and then there's also, on the topic of change and engagement, I think one thing folks need to be careful about is, although it's important to have sort of lots of community meetings, okay, town hall gatherings, grassroots efforts to learn from all the various user groups what they want out of a deployment. I think that those should definitely happen. But there can be this bad habit that happens because people are in the room. There's a compulsion to have lots of doing, lots of thinking, and lots of seeking out of, say, finely grained preferences, okay, just because they're in the room and they feel like that's what they ought to be doing. But that can get in the way of leveraging from your vendor, with a V, that is, by the lender, okay, leveraging the hundreds of deployments that your vendor has already done, and kind of reside in that vendor's institutional knowledge, okay? ABL is ABL. Well, let me back up and kind of not use jargon. Asset-based lending is asset-based lending. I know everybody listening to us right now might be thinking, "No, David, our ABL is actually pretty special." But it's not. Your vendor, when they work with you, they've already done dozens, maybe hundreds of deployments, including in specialized areas such as ABL. So be opportunistic, okay? Let the hundreds of ABL lenders that went before you with your vendor make your deployment more effective, on scope, and on time. In other words, don't reinvent that tire. Maybe decide exactly what treads you're going to have on it, what rim you'll have on it, what the sheen will look like on the rubber, all those things, instead of building the wheel from the ground up. And Thomas, back to you.
Yeah, I hear exactly what you're saying, David. There's a lot of people that can start to sidetrack implementations, but it's also important, as to Andy's point, to get that feedback. So it's definitely a fine balance for sure. But let's say, for just argument's sake, that we avoid all those ideas and that maybe kind of affect implementation. What's the business case when we really talk about configuration and customization? Why separating people from it, it's such an important decision for an institution to think about?
So the first thought I have is that if when folks customize any deployment, really, okay, it can feel like a one-time decision, and it's actually not at all a one-time decision. It's actually the opposite of a one-time decision. It's a cascading decision with kind of profound implications, okay? In my opinion, and again, I've interviewed lots of people on this topic, to the degree that you customize, you have entered the software business, okay? And that is not an exaggeration, okay? And this is a very tricky and risky decision to make, either on purpose or by accident, because you're not in the software business. You don't even want to be in the software business part-time or kind of part-time, because no, you're in the business of gathering deposits and capital, redeploying those resources as loans, and monitoring the resulting risk. Okay, and when you customize, okay, and most customization is over customization, you wind up with a whole lot of responsibilities down the line after the go live date that are underestimated, costly, make you less nimble when it comes time to adapt your deployment for, say, a new portal or some new technology, or maybe a new way to interact with millennials over a channel of their preference. Okay, and primary among my concerns is that, well, to get a little granular here, we're all getting our capabilities over the SaaS pipe, so to speak. And when we've kind of entered the software business and customized our deployment because of our own supposed granular specialness, new upgrades, products, enhancements, and other things can cause deployments to become unstable. It's almost as if when you deploy with customization, you see only the chunk of the iceberg that is above the water. Thoughts on that, Andy?
Yeah, spot on, right? So, yeah, the iceberg principle, iceberg theory, basically, you can't see or detect most of a situation's, data. So you're spot on with the fact that what seems like maybe a benign decision to, hey, let's customize the following thing, seems straightforward. What happens though is the effect of it is compounded in some degree. So you don't think about every time a new broader release comes out, the fact that regression testing, backwards compatibility checks, all that has to be done to ensure that previous kind of workarounds and customizations are preserved. And so then oftentimes what happens is that delays the acceptance of, say, a new release of which you could use 95% of it, but you're unable to because there's some kind of issue relating to some innocuous, seemingly minor customization that was done months or years ago. So I couldn't agree more. I think that on the surface, it always looks like potentially a no-brainer, something straightforward, something that's harmless. Oftentimes, though, what's beneath the sea is if you could see it then, you'd never make that decision to go straight at it again.
Yeah, and this trade-off really invokes a bunch of challenges with training, project timelines, dealing with one another in sort of the town hall meetings and grassroots gathering of deployments. And what can be tricky is holding the line and seeking not to accommodate every desired deployment complexity sought by certain individuals or groups who are kind of favored or who have clout in the organization. I think it's important to hold the line with these folks because, as I said a few minutes ago, every customization before you do the deployment, consumes resources in the form of cost or time or both. And they always materialize in taking something away from something else. And here's another thing. People's perceptions before and after the go live date of a deployment are profoundly, profoundly different. Before the deployment, when we're in those town hall meetings and brown bag lunches and meetings in which we're gathering business requirements, they think they know what they want in a finely grained way from the deployment. Okay, but I've seen many, many times that they're often wrong. It often turns out that they don't need the customization they think they need. They can actually get that from a configuration that's also available, or they might not even need that configuration or highly specialized and granular business requirement as much as they want. My suggestion is to kind of narrow the scope of customization absolutely, as much as possible down to zero, and maybe even minimize the scope of configuration to get live, okay? And it's okay to be a little bit scrummy in a deployment like this. It's okay to get live and then see if you, I'm going to use kind of fun language here, to get live and then see if you really, really need those granular customizations or those, God forbid, actual customizations. In other words, get very, very careful about what's theoretically needed before the go live date and what turns out to be a real need after the go live date. Okay, and Andy, in talking about this, I think last week or something like that, I know you had some strong feelings about optimization reviews. I'd love it if you could talk about that a little bit.
Right. I do think, in general, one of the happiest days, in someone's professional life is the day they make a decision, right, on moving forward with a certain project or buying a product, that they feel is going to, cure a bunch of ills, right? And then the longer amount of time that you get away from that day, things start to wane. So I am a big believer in getting in and deriving value from your purchase sooner rather than later. And a great way to do that is, as you mentioned, is having the mindset of a minimum viable product kind of out of the gate. And one way you ensure you have that is by partnering with somebody that is able to share with you how many other like-sized organizations with similar concentrations, what they're doing and how they're leveraging that product today. And it's like the age-old 80-20 rule, right? Like 80% of what you need, you could probably start using closer to day zero than, say, day 365. So big believer in that, getting up and live and exercising. And then once you're actually in the system and leveraging it, a lot of the things, to your point, that you might have thought you needed at the beginning, you might find are irrelevant because they're addressed elsewhere within the system, or they weren't as big of a deal as you thought they were going to be. But then that's where a cadence of optimization reviews are a really important practice to really build reinforcement with the rest of your staff and team. The fact of the matter is that how you're using the product today might need to evolve, right, as things internal or externally change, right? New variables get introduced. So it is a very, very good practice to constantly reassess how you're using the tool. And you might find that there are things that used to be important that aren't anymore that you can eliminate. And there's the need to introduce things that hadn't been contemplated before. But the fact of the matter is that all of that is an output from you actually getting in and using the system, not theorizing on the outside.
Yeah, and speaking of before and after go live to before and after states of the deployment, okay, I think that the ultimate state of a deployment and its simplicity, its stability, has kind of a meta impact, okay? And on my mind here is sort of the intellectual bench at a bank in general, and the fact that there's a real war for talent on out there. Lots of commercial lenders tell me that among the biggest barriers they have to growth is the acquisition of talent that can underwrite risk. They can underwrite risk. They have a hard time finding, recruiting, hiring, and retaining both lenders and underwriters. And the better your automation is, okay, the more you're going to attract those younger workers that you need to replace. Frankly, the many baby boomers and Gen Xers who are retiring or close to retiring. And I just want to add here, the differences between boomers on the one hand and I'm sorry, the difference between boomers and Xers on the one hand and millennials isn't just sort of trivia for poking fun at one another at a dinner party. We do a lot of psychographics here at Aite-Novarica Group, and we've been doing them for a long time, and there's something really interesting going on right now. When we do psychographic analyses in which we compare millennials to boomers and Gen Xers, we consistently see differences that are not only statistically significant, okay, that makes our quant people happy, but they're actually large differences, okay, including attitudes about technology. All right. So it is important. Here are two things. First of all, it will enable you to kind of compete better, for you to have deployments that are easier, not over complicated, more stable. It'll make it easier for you to, for one thing, attract millennials. But we've known for a long time, okay, that loan officers and underwriters of any generation, they absolutely will change banks for technology that not only has good UIs, but is stable and straightforward and enables them to, again, be at the top of Maslow's hierarchy of activities. In other words, spending more time, okay, in the role of trusted advisor, capital T, capital A, rather than the person toiling in front of a deployment that has too much complexity. Okay, and in the end, I think that the best automated environments, okay, with the most straightforward deployments, with the best uptime, these are going to be the deployments that are best at attracting folks. In other words, those most able to get around this growth barrier will be the ones most desirable to work at. That means good, straightforward technology that makes non-core tasks easy without undue complexity, or use of task, will be the best at attracting new talent. So I guess at this point, it's kind of time to summarize, and I think I'll start here. When you deploy CLO, your primary goals should be to minimize cost, maximize adoption, to deploy on scope, and by on scope, meaning hitting all of your business requirement. Over customization, and most customization is over customization, introduces friction for all of these things, and it keeps you from getting value, all of the value from your vendor that is available. They've done dozens, maybe hundreds of deployments like the one you're undertaking. And there's a great deal of value in that vendor's institutional knowledge. It's up to you to extract the value in that knowledge by deploying based on it. Truly, there are only so many ways you can configure the terms of an ABL loan. So leverage all of their capabilities for configuration of ABL loan, because configuration rather than customization will probably get you pretty much all of what you want. And memorialization or replication in automation of how exactly you do something, such as an ABL loan, how it's done in a new deployment, has far less value than you think compared to doing it based on the entire institutional knowledge of your vendor and all of the clients that have preceded you. And that's actually an understatement. I said it has less value than you might think. What I think is actually true, it has far more costs than you would guess. In fact, I think a great deal of cascading disruptive costs.
I think that's a great way to end it and wrap it up. A great summary, but I think there's a lot of discussion around customization and configuration. We've talked about the pandemic and some of the underlying effects, as you mentioned, with millennials, Gen Xers. And so I think it's an important conversation and one that we'll be hearing progressively more and more about moving forward over the coming months. So I want to thank Andy and David. Thank you all so much for joining us. And for those of you that are listening for the first time, you can find this and future episodes of the podcast on abrigo.com or on your favorite podcast app or platform. Just search Ahead of the Curve, a Banker's Podcast, and hit subscribe. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll be back again with you.